Okay.
Welcome to the Oregon Housing and Community Services webinar on the statewide housing plan policy update and update of the progress in the plan. My name is Shoshana Oppenheim, and I am the Planning and Policy Manager at Oregon Housing and Community Services and the Project Manager for the statewide housing plan. I am joined by Kirsten Green, who has been working with us on developing our work and performing some of the outreach related to the statewide housing plan. The purpose of the webinar today is to share an overview of the plan and share some of the data that we are considering, as well as to receive your guidance on the development of our work. After in-person research with hundreds of Oregonians and service providers in the fall, and extensive data analysis on Oregon's housing needs, as well as the funding supply, Oregon Housing and Community Services is presenting 9 draft policy priorities for your review and consideration today. These policy priorities will guide the development of our 5-year strategy called the Statewide Housing Plan. Thank you again for joining us. First, to take care of a few housekeeping items, this webinar will be recorded and available for view later. It will be posted to the Statewide Housing Plan website in about a week. Before we go any further, I mentioned the website, and I want to make sure you know where it is to find all the information that we're sharing today and the data that supports it. You can find our previous reports, webinars, presentations, as well as our statewide and countywide profiles on the Oregon Housing and Community Services Statewide Housing Plan website. I sent an email earlier today to all the people registered for the webinar. It has a link to a survey which is open until July 9th. If you have not received the link, you can find it on our project website. You can go to the link above to find the survey. Please take some time to respond to the survey after the close of today's webinar. Also, questions on the data sources or questions that may be too complicated to answer in the time allowed will be posted to our website. So we want to make sure that you have accurate information and we have enough time to get to the heart of the conversation. We also wanted to give you an update about where we are in the development of the statewide housing plan. Just to remind you, last fall and winter, we traveled throughout the state listening to low-income Oregonians, service providers, developers, and partners in providing housing stability to learn about the extent of the housing crisis. We have reviewed data about housing needs, homelessness, cost burden, homeownership, in order to better understand how Oregonians are struggling and how we can improve our work. Now we want to share the policy priorities that are emerging from and the data that they are based on. These policy priorities will support the development of the statewide housing plan. We are interested in your feedback on what we have learned and the direction that we are going. So again, please feel free to use the survey to share your opinions. Now let's get started. One of the most pressing questions we wanted to answer is which populations are most vulnerable to homelessness? Clearly, Oregon's lowest income households face the most severe housing burdens. We're talking about people that are earning between $0 and $16,000 a year. They are people on Social Security, people with disabilities, or working minimum wage jobs, working less than full time. The vast majority of low and extremely low income people are experience housing a burden, and therefore are at increased risk of becoming homeless because they have little or no income at the end of the month for savings or to deal with an emergency that may come up. A full 94% of households with incomes below 15% MFI or more pay more than 50% of their income on housing and utilities. As you are aware, severe housing cost burden It can be a major contributing factor to a family or individual's reason for becoming homeless. This slide lets us look at the issue of homelessness with another lens. The graph shows the number of homeless students during the 2016 and 2017 school year by county. Although Multnomah County has nearly twice as many counted students experiencing homelessness, the counties of Jackson, Josephine, Tillamook, and Curry, as well as Lincoln, have a higher proportion of students who are experiencing homelessness to their student population. What this slide shows again is that student homelessness is a statewide problem which looks different in different communities, and some students are experiencing homelessness in shelters, motels, some are doubled up, some are living with family and friends. There are hundreds of thousands of Oregonians with critical housing needs due to disability, mental illness, a history of domestic violence, substance abuse issues, or the need to be housed after incarceration. The housing needs and challenges of each of these populations are unique and require special attention and collaboration across agencies and programs. According to the most current data we have from the Coalition of Oregon Domestic and Sexual Violence Service Providers, there were over 131,000 calls related to domestic violence and assault, stalking, and other issues. This recent study showed that 12,017 requests for shelter from adult survivors were unable to be met. Also, in a 2018 report on the revocation of post-prison supervision, the Department of Corrections stated that there are about 63,000 Oregonians that are supervised by community corrections throughout the state. Additionally, 413 people are released each month from incarceration. People released from incarceration face a number of barriers to finding housing. It can be difficult for newly released persons to become stable with their income. The conditions of parole may be in conflict and may prevent them from living with friends and family. Landlords may be simply refuse to rent to them based on criminal histories. According to OHCS's data, there are just 596 assisted rental units for people exiting incarceration in the entire state. This chart outlines the impact of homelessness on various communities. It's clear again from the data that what we expected to see about populations of people that are experiencing housing burden shows up in the homeless data. Importantly, African Americans are only 1.8% of the population, yet they represent 6% of the homeless population. Native Americans are only 0.9% of the population, but are 4.2% of the homeless population. People who identify as two or more races are 3.3% of the population, and yet they represent 6.8% of the homeless population. We also see the impact to rural communities in this slide. 21.7% of the population lives in rural Oregon, while they represent 27.1% of the homeless population. It's estimated that there are over 1,300 homeless veterans in Oregon on any given night, and many more who are at risk of homelessness due to poverty, lack of support networks, and dismal living conditions. Although these numbers have trended downward in the past decade, veterans represent more than 9% of all homeless Oregonians. According to the Oregon Veterans Administration, this means that those who have served in the military, both men and women, are significantly more likely to become homeless than the general public. It's also striking in this slide that almost 30% of the homeless population are households with children. It's challenging to determine the need for permanent supportive housing. The Corporation for Supportive Housing is the nation's leader in developing a methodology to determine this need. Drawing on the best available data, they estimated that 12,388 vulnerable Oregonians need supportive housing with services to maintain the support they need to live independently. Oregon leads the states with the largest median rent increases from 2013 to 2017. In that time, the percent change in rent was 30%, from a median rent of $1,242 to $1,619. Even with the growing economy and wages beginning to rise across the state, households are having an increasingly difficult time competing in these challenging housing markets. The lowest income Oregonians face the most severe housing burdens. Households with income at or below 30% of the median family income are considered extremely low income. The vast majority of extremely low renters experience severe housing cost burden and therefore are at an increased risk of becoming homeless because they have so little income left at the end of the month for savings to deal with any emergency costs that come up. Severe cost burden can be a major contributing factor to a family or individual's reason for becoming homeless. Further, rents can prevent people from transitioning out of homelessness. Oregon has one of the top 5 highest percentages of unsheltered homeless people in the country. There is a critical and urgent need for more permanent, affordable rental units to serve homelessness and low-income Oregonians. For the most part, housing burden disproportionately affects people of color because they are more likely than the overall population to face this housing challenge. You can see from the chart that African American people, people of mixed race, Native Americans, Latinos are all experiencing housing burden disproportionately. In many communities, there's little incentive to upgrade naturally occurring affordable housing because community rents are low and the owners do not see the value in making improvements. This slide shows that the age of housing stock and indicates that 12% of the units were built before 1940. An additional 44% were built between 1940 and 1980. The risk of lead-based paint hazards is greater in units built before 1980. And in general, these homes may be in need of significant rehabilitation and repairs. The problem of poor housing quality is a persistent problem in manufactured and mobile home parks. More than 55% of manufactured homes in Oregon were built before 1980, and construction of homes was unregulated before 1976. The age of stock of manufactured homes is compounded by the instability of not owning the land that the home sits on. A family experiences energy burden when they're spending more than 6% of their income on utilities. Severe energy burden is when spending more than 10% of one's income on utilities. Low-income Oregonians are often put in the situation of choosing between heat, housing, and other basic needs like food and medicine. Of households earning extremely low incomes, about 80% of them are energy burdened. Approximately 54% of households earning very low incomes are energy burdened, and 31% of households earning between 51 and 80% of the median family income are energy burdened. Homeownership rates across the country were steadily declining since the foreclosure crisis in Oregon, and Oregon was no exception. The U.S. homeownership rate has steadily declined since 2005, while Oregon's has fluctuated a bit more. There has been recent growth in homeownership, increasing to 62.6%. Even with this increase, Oregon has the 8th lowest homeownership rate in the United States. This decline in homeownership is a result of a number of factors. Household growth was stagnant for many years as a result of the recession, indicating that new households were not forming and not looking to buy. This decline is also the result of tightening underwriting restrictions, which have limited access to home mortgages and as well as increased student debt among young would-be first-time home buyers. Homeownership for people of color is even more elusive and continues to be out of reach for many communities. Homeownership rates also declined among almost every racial and ethnic group in Oregon from 2005 to 2016, as seen in the OHCS data. People of color experience disproportionately low homeownership rates compared to white households or the population as a whole. Changes made to underwriting standards as a result of the housing crisis have disproportionately affected low-income households with higher debt-to-income ratios, lower credit scores, characteristics that are more likely to affect young people and people of color. As the rental market tightens and rent increases, they result in declining homeownership rates. Communities of color often face displacement, increased rent burden, and increased eviction or homelessness. This slide allows us to take a look at cost burden statewide. This map displays the rate of cost burden for Oregon households earning less than 60% of their area median family income, as calculated at the county level. The rate of renter cost burden is particularly acute in Eastern Oregon, where more than 80% of households below 60% MFI are cost burdened. This is likely due to a combination of the lack of available affordable housing and lower incomes. You saw this slide earlier when we were talking about homelessness. Homelessness and housing insecurity are not only an urban problem, and the solutions in rural communities may be different due to the distances that people have to travel to obtain services and the service areas of some of our partners being hundreds of miles. Some of the highest rate of households with incomes below 15% of their area's median family income are in rural areas, such as Klamath, Lake, Harney, and Malheur counties in Southern Oregon. So that's some of the data that we've collected and that was influencing our policy priorities. Now I'm going to hand off the presentation to Kirsten Green to walk us through the policy priorities that OHCS is considering to address the needs that we've highlighted.
Thank you. Good morning. It's been a pleasure to be able to work with OHCS on these draft policy priorities. I'm Kirsten Green. As Shoshana mentioned, they are derived from a range of qualitative and quantitative sources: the outreach in phase 1, the environmental scan of OHCS's 52 funding streams, data related to our extreme housing need in Oregon, and informed by best practices and other public policy priorities on the state and federal level. There are 9 draft policy priorities that I'm going to touch on today. The final number in the draft plan this fall could be fewer, as some may be consolidated. And we're looking for your feedback. At this phase, it's quite high level. We're looking to see if we're on the right track or wrong track in the survey Shoshana mentioned. And we're looking for your guidance on how to best implement and any cautions you might provide to the agency as they flesh out these policy priorities. So the first is to establish an agency and program-wide equity review. Given the disparities evident in the data, OHCS is committed to a program-by-program review of investments and desired outcome with specific targets and monitoring and adjustment aimed to fill opportunity gaps that exist among Oregon's residents. Some of the key considerations for this policy priority are to include and respond to our fair housing obligations, and also to respond to the call to affirmatively further fair housing, to try to place affordable housing in opportunity areas throughout communities in Oregon. OHCS is considering the benefits and the drawbacks of a holistic agency-wide approach versus simply looking program by program at equity-oriented policies. It's a forest and the trees approach focused on the person. OHCS is very concerned with considering responses from a human-centered perspective on how to improve access to core services for underrepresented households across Oregon. So for example, that would be coordinated access and entry for services within and among agencies and service providers, making it easy to access services that Oregonians need. The second policy priority is to target or focus resources on specific populations to address known disparities and unique needs. So given the disparity and the disproportionate impact Shoshana just covered, what we know of best practices for community-specific focus on particular subpopulations, OHCS is considering focusing these resources for maximum impact on specific populations across the spectrum of need. As you've heard, people of color have disproportionately lower median incomes than all households, and for African American and Native American populations, there are disparities in homelessness, cost burden, and homeownership. We also know that single-parent households face particular challenge, and we're acutely aware of what that means for children and their stability. Some of the key considerations for this policy priority is that we do know from national best practices that focusing resources, or quote-unquote targeting, has had success in other states, that the results are better longer term. OHCS would focus resources across the spectrum of their funding sources, across housing and services, traditionally separate funding sources, and focus on specific subpopulations that would be determined based on need, and also opportunities to be opportunistic to leverage interagency work, such as we've all seen the focus on veteran homelessness in the last decade. The third draft policy priority is to develop a coordinated statewide approach to prevent and end homelessness. Of course, this is ambitious given the data Shoshana just covered, but it's necessary to minimize gaps. OHCS proposes to engage in a concerted, focused effort with its partners to build a coordinated, responsive, cross-sector strategy to prevent and end homelessness. An important component of this work is the development of an inventory of shelters, needs, and gaps in the system across Oregon's rural and urban communities. OHCS would study the cost, services, and shelter types of year-round and seasonal shelters. This analysis highlights best practices in Oregon, partnering with our service providers, and studies what other states have found successful, looking at regional and local systems, and will inform future training opportunities for service delivery coordination. For this policy priority, with respect to developing a coordinated statewide approach, I mentioned OHCS would be harnessing best practices from local partners, people that provide the services today, and national research. OHCS would be looking to and beyond the funds it administers to bridge efforts across agencies, local and state, with federal resources as well, through urban and rural communities, integrating housing and services. OHCS is considering highlighting wraparound services in this approach, which leads us to our next policy priority. Draft policy priority 4 is to create a permanent supportive housing strategy. With the Oregon Health Authority, OHCS has brought together a statewide permanent supportive housing work group to make recommendations on an approach to address chronic homelessness. The work group is advising OHA, the Oregon Health Authority, and Oregon Housing and Community Services on key program and policy considerations. They're working on developing an implementation framework to support the housing and health service needs of homeless individuals or individuals at risk of homelessness. The work group will leverage legislative, local, and state agency funds from OHA and OHCS, as well as other partner agencies, to develop strategies for increased supportive housing capacity across the state. The work is estimated to be complete in June 2019. Please stay tuned and stay involved. Some key considerations for this priority are that we know it is evidence-based nationally. It does show results. The evidence shows that integrating housing strategies and approaches to decrease homelessness and improve health supports care coordination and linkage between non-medical settings and promoting transitions from institutional settings to less costly community-based care settings. These investments reduce unnecessary emergency, inpatient, and residential treatment facility utilization and increase access to and the use of primary behavioral and substance abuse disorder services. OHCS has funded permanent supportive housing in the past, but has not had a dedicated approach to this funding, especially on the services side. A few more key considerations are that public permanent supportive housing units may require deeper subsidy. More OHCS resources could be called to PSH and could result in fewer homes being built overall. So that there's a dynamic tension between investing more holistically in the Oregonian versus building more houses. Interested to know what you think. It's a new way of using funds and would require training at the service delivery level. And OHCS is concerned to ensure sustainability in the long term because we know that shifting to this service model is a big move in Oregon. The work could be aligned with the U.S. Department of Justice's Oregon Performance Plan to increase the number of individuals with serious and persistent mental illness in supportive housing. Their goal is 2,000 individuals by next June 30th, 2019. More information on the work group is available as a link from OHCS's homepage on the right side of the screen, from OHCS's website, main homepage. The fifth policy priority is to create an impactful multifamily housing strategy for renters. OHCS is exploring ways to make existing finance programs more strategic, user-friendly, and effective to create a greater impact on new construction, preservation, and acquisition. Some key consideration of this policy priorities are to create a clear and efficient pathway for new construction, preservation, and service provision. They are all critical. OHCS will be working to establish a detailed qualified allocation plan, selection criteria, and set-asides based on the characteristics of need. We just saw a preview of that and is outlined in the draft plan this fall. We're also looking at evaluation and expansion of the LIFT program. This would be a component of the multifamily housing strategy. For example, LIFT 1.0 dedicated over $22 million in resources to 5 projects throughout the state to build 643 units for communities of color. OHCS is looking to apply those lessons learned to contribute to this multifamily housing strategy development. OHCS is also planning to develop an agricultural workforce housing study aimed at updating statewide information on agricultural workforce housing with the goal of gaining a better understanding of those needs and barriers. So the I is the conclusion, sort of that last bullet there is the focus is driving towards production targets with an eye towards the range of population needs in Oregon. One other consideration OHCS is looking at is funding, is helping develop a fund to acquire unsubsidized affordable units, also known as naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA. These strategies are necessary where there's high development costs, low vacancy rates, and incomes that are not keeping pace with the high cost of rent, which is basically throughout Oregon. If successful, this effort would preserve units and bring them into the portfolio of affordability. The sixth draft policy priority is to pursue income generation models. Won't surprise anyone on this webinar that there's a significant gap in resource across the continuum with a need to increase fiscal sustainability. Accordingly, OHCS is pursuing income generation ideas to grow the pie, if you will, and expand and stabilize resources available for their mission of ensuring housing stability for Oregonians. This is a bit of a deep dive into housing finance agencies nationally. Just wanted to kind of draw participants' attention to other housing finance agencies throughout the United States. Most housing finance agencies, or HFAs, focus on income generation as a core value to broaden the scope and impact of their programs. Specifically, they utilize their ability to issue tax-exempt bonds and allocate tax credits, accessing government-sponsored entities and programs, benefits available only to HFAs, and to leverage other resources to generate revenue in excess of operating expenses. Those revenues are then utilized to fund new programs and other mission-driven investments with public oversight. In other words, other HFAs throughout the nation aren't reliant solely on state or federal appropriations to fund their programs, as is Oregon. OHCS hopes to learn about the most effective and efficient ways to generate income using our authority as an HFA and what the best practices are relating to investing that income. We are working with the National Council of State Housing Agencies to survey FHA's experience with these models across the country and learn from their best practices. Other key considerations, one other idea is to include strategies to revolve OHCS resources, offering loans and grants in some cases. Research suggests Oregon is alone among HFAs that offer only grants for development projects. So there are opportunities to expand single-family mortgage projects, as I mentioned, and that HFAs across the country use both these strategies with success. Number 7 out of 9, building an emphasis on healthy homes. Given what we know about housing conditions for low-income Oregonians, and they aren't good, OHCS is considering focused approaches to ensure the built home environment is healthy for renters and homeowners across rural and urban Oregon for all ages. Some key considerations for this policy priority are to utilize both energy and weatherization options, both very popular and effective programs, and to look at manufactured housing. Shoshana mentioned this, opportunities to make significant headway in purchasing rather than rehabilitation some of those homes, and to really focus on, again, the lived experience of low-income renters and owners with poor housing conditions, and provide technical assistance and resources for them to improve housing conditions as needed. As background, OHCS has 2 programs dedicated to energy assistance and 5 programs dedicated to weatherization. These are programs that offer energy and weatherization assistance to Oregon households and are critical components of housing stability and preservation. They're broadly applicable to both homeowners and renters and are used currently throughout the state. Energy assistance programs primarily provide bill payment assistance to Oregonians at or below 60% of state median income. That can make the difference between the ability to afford rent or mortgage or not. Weatherization assistance programs primarily focus on longer-term energy savings upgrades, minor home repairs, and home health improvements for households at or below 200% of federal poverty level. There are 8 healthy homes principles that OHCS is considering in this regard. The first is to develop improved methods for evaluating health hazards in housing. The second is to develop improved methods for preventing and reducing health hazards in housing. The third is to support development of objective measures for what is considered a healthy residential environment. Fourth, to evaluate the long-term cost effectiveness of this healthy housing approach. 5, to promote the incorporation of healthy housing principles once defined into program delivery and systems. 6, to improve the traction and spread of healthy housing information, including best practices to partners, grantees, the private sector, and community members and residents. 7th principle would be to explore and pursue sustainable funding strategies for healthy homes initiatives, because we know there's more demand than supply. And 8, to work towards building statewide capacity and delivering the program. Shoshana mentioned the stock of manufactured housing. OHCS is looking into how the agency can leverage funds for home repair and weatherization to really have an impact and to perhaps make significant energy efficiency and home health impact through home replacement rather than repair. OHCS is partnering with Business Oregon to target rehab CDBG dollars to manufactured homes. This will be an important resource to stabilize Oregonians in manufactured homes. We know that people are living in poor housing conditions throughout the state and are often not willing or able to complain due to concern about losing their housing. Addressing this discrimination and fear of retribution and eviction are a concern of the policy priorities. 8th, nearly there, 2 more. 8th is to expand home ownership and tackle disparities. As you all know, too many Oregonians find home ownership out of reach, which threaten their housing stability and financial opportunities. OHCS is considering strategies to expand their homeownership work and to aggressively tackle the minority homeownership gap. Some of the key considerations regarding expanding homeownership and this tackling of disparities is to how better to align existing programs such as down payment assistance, individual development accounts, or IDAs, mortgage lending, and other services to further homeownership across the spectrum of need. OHCS is exploring new mortgage product to serve additional borrowers, and there is, in 2008, the Oregon legislature established a task force to address racial disparities in home ownership. OHCS will be a partner in developing strategies to reduce these disparities experienced by prospective homeowners of color. Number 9, the last draft policy priority, is to invest strategically in rural Oregon. And by no means is this the least important. These are not ranked by any means. Given the data on rural disparity, OHCS is considering an intentional, multifaceted rural investment strategy across OHCS programs. County level data, as you've seen, show that there are high cost burdens in rural areas. Building housing is expensive due to scarce capital. The scale of development possible in rural communities, I should say the lesser scale of development possible in rural communities, and development capacity by itself. We know the cost burden is particularly acute in rural communities, and there's a high proportion of students experiencing homelessness. Challenges to building affordable housing looks different across the state, differing even between northeastern and southeastern Oregon, central, southern Oregon, the gorge, and the coast. The key considerations for this policy priority would include addressing underlying barriers to this capacity gap for rural housing development, integrating housing and service delivery as well, and connecting this initiative to the Rural Housing Accelerator legislative concept, helping address and increase local capacity, technical expertise, and financial resources available to rural Oregon. At this point, that is the full 9 of the draft policy priorities. Appreciate your listening, and like to turn it back to Shoshana, who's been monitoring questions submitted by webinar participants.
Thank you so much. Again, you have up on your screen our website, which has today's PowerPoint presentation, as well as a link to the survey. Please do visit our website and provide us your thoughts and considerations via the survey. You can also write a more detailed response at our email address, which is hcs.swhp@oregon.gov. I wanted to also let you know what our next steps are, but first I wanted to let you know there was a question about when the webinar would be posted. It'll be posted within a week, and the survey will be open until July 9th. So our next steps for developing the statewide housing plan are more conversations with key stakeholders similar to this, where we solicit feedback on our work, refine our priorities, and develop the strategies that we can use to implement good policy that is responsive to the statewide housing needs. We expect to have a draft plan for you for review this fall. So I don't see any, so there's a question, where can I get more information about Objective 8, the Healthy Homes Policy Priority? I can, if you send me an email, I can connect you with Tim Zimmer at our agency, who can give you more information about that policy priority. Let's see, there's another question. Strategy 5 discusses multifamily strategy, housing strategy. Will this strategy include little p preservation to protect and ensure the health of existing affordable housing? So definitely this is a great question, and we welcome your insight and reflection on that. Again, an email with your concerns would be helpful. And Alyssa, I noted that, and I can have a response for you shortly. When will the website on the current slides be live? It's blocked by the administrator right now. Well, thank you very much, Ryan, for letting us know that. I will have it unblocked shortly, so I would imagine before the close of business today. If there's no other questions, I think you have our contact information. We really welcome your feedback and thoughts, your participation today. This survey is critically important. We will be using that information to direct our work moving forward. And we thank you for your participation today. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any further questions. No. So I think you have to end.